Welcome to this conference initiated by the Journal of Peasant Studies and co-hosted by the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of Western Cape, South Africa, the Transnational Institute, TNI, and the collective of agrarian scholar activists from the South, CASAS. My name is Jacobo Grajales, and I am your chair for today's session. Let me tell you a bit before we start about our organizing committee, which is composed of Amita Baviskar, June Boras, Shaila Sesha Galvin, Ruth Hall, Ricardo Jacobs, Sergio Sauer, Ian Skoons, Annie Shattuck, and myself for JPS. For TNI, our conveners are Jennifer Franco and Katie Sandwell. Ruth Hall and George Mudimu for PLAS, and for CASAS, Diana Aguiar, Duigu Avci, Mercedes Ejarque, Sinem Kavak, Amit Kurian, Boa Monjane, and Jackson Washira. And a special mention to the fact that this is the making of a group of scholar activists doing this out of passion and the shared conviction that this kind of conference provides an important venue for one of the most important debates of our times. And finally, we would like to thank Rosalind Luxembourg, Stichting Southern Africa for their support. Just a couple of practical questions before we start. We will be collecting questions from the Q&A. So please ask your questions over the Q&A. You might feel that your question is not being responded directly, but some of our colleagues will be clustering questions and sending them to the chair to nurture the debate during the session. And also, please feel free to rename yourself if you are concerned about your safety. We have enabled this possibility from the technical side. If you are on Twitter, don't forget to tweet using Climate Agrarian Change. And now I think that we are ready to begin. Our desire to organize this conference is based on the observation that the specific impacts and implications of climate change for rural people have not been sufficiently addressed, nor in research or the policy debates. And yet critical scholars and activists, and this is something that we will see through the 4 days, tell us that the climate crisis is intertwined with different forms of agrarian crisis due to neoliberal policies, indebtedness, productivist agriculture, and predatory politics. Climate change plays out through landscapes shaped by histories of class struggle, of colonialism, of capitalism. And this determines different forms and intensities of its impact along geographical, class, gender, and racial lines. Well, these are some of the topics that we will be discussing over the next 4 days. Today's session in particular will feature the participation of 4 activists and scholars who have been deeply involved with environmental struggles around the world and who will share their views on the intimate links of climate change with issues of agrarian justice and social struggles. So let me start by introducing our panelists. First of all, Ruth Nyambura. Ruth, you are a Kenyan feminist and organizer. You recently served as the global coordinator of the Hands Off Mother Earth campaign, and you are the founder and convener of the African Eco-Feminist Collective. Welcome, Ruth. Minh Zo. Minh, you are a social justice activist and writer from Myanmar. You also hold a PhD in Natural Resources Management from Australia National University. And in 2015, you were awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize. Welcome, Minh. Antolin Huascar, you are a peasant and indigenous leader from Peru. You were until recently, the president of the National Agrarian Confederation of Peru. And you are currently a delegate at La Via Campesina and a member of the Climate Justice Collective. welcome. And finally, Ian Schoons. Ian, you are a professor of international development at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex in the UK. And your work deals with environmental and agrarian change, particularly in Africa, with a strong focus on pastoralism. You are a member of the editorial collective of the Journal of Peasant Studies. I would like to start with you, Ian. You are one of the authors of a framing paper that was recently published by the Journal of Peasant Studies. This paper was sort of an invitation to contribute to the journal with papers dealing with what critical agrarian studies had to say about climate change. In a way, this paper was the starting point of the intellectual endeavor that brings us together today, right? In this paper, you and your co-authors deal with the link between capitalism and climate change in rural settings. Now, it might be a good starting point for you to tell us, to elaborate a bit on the main arguments of this paper.
Thanks very much. Hopefully somebody can put the link to the paper in the chat, because it's quite a long paper and I can only give a brief summary. But yeah, basically, issues of climate change and capitalism, as you've said, and indeed, let's not forget, forms of state socialism are deeply entwined. This much we know, but how this plays out in the rural world and the implications for agrarian struggles are much more poorly understood. This is why we decided to launch the JPS Forum on Climate Change and Agrarian Justice, and the forum framing paper, you said, lays out some of the challenges and invited responses. And as participants in the conference hopefully know, there are already 14 papers published in the JPS as part of the forum, and I think there's another 20, if not more, in the pipeline. And as you say, the conference is an important moment to debate these. In the framing paper, we looked at debates about capitalism and nature, for example. Now, there are very many different angles, conceptual, theoretical, but the bottom line is that capitalist forms of accumulation operate through what Jason Moore and Raj Patel called cheap nature. Nature made cheap in price and cheapened through the processes of capitalist transformation. We see this again and again in how processes of extractivism play out in the rural world. Land grabbing, water grabbing, green grabbing are some of the examples. And it's in these moments around these issues where the climate change and agrarian struggles come together. And this is absolutely key, we argue, for mobilization. And overall in the paper, we argue that if the challenges of climate change are to be tackled, then an inclusive, broad-based, anti-capitalist movement needs to be forged. And in Eric Olin Wright's terms, this must act to erode capitalism, both from above and below, and through mobilizations that combine the strategic logics of what he calls dismantling, escaping, taming, and resisting capitalism, and focusing overall unfailingly on the damaging, cheapening effects of capitalist accumulation and extractivism. Crucially, this, we argue, makes it vitally important to connect environmental and agrarian movements, which are actually often currently rather separated and sometimes even in tension. And I hope that's a theme that we can come back to later in our conversation.
Thank you very much, Ian. Just a quick reminder that as we have instant translation, it might be important to speak slowly. So a quick reminder for all my fellow panelists. Ruth, from I'm not sure, Ruth, you can hear me. I don't see you in the. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I just wanted to be sure that you could hear me. Ruth, from what Ian said, I have the impression that we might be able to conclude that people find themselves at the crossroads of sort of intersecting crises, that they struggle to articulate a response to these crises. Now you have a very broad view, a very encompassing view of a variety of social struggles in the African continent. Could you please tell us a bit more about where social movements find themselves right now?
Thank you. But you might also need to clarify which truth, because there are two prominent truths.
Yes, sorry, Nyambura.
Yeah, so, okay. I'm going to start actually by speaking about the Kenyan context. As most of you know, just 2 weeks ago, a new government came into power. It's a very right-wing, conservative, actually neoliberal, theocratic, fascist government that's come to power in this country. Very particular ideas of all of us need to be very Christian in a very evangelical form. For the last 10 years, feminists across the continent have been tracking, evangelical Christians in the US, the amount of money that has been not just pouring into churches in Africa, but into the political space. So this is one of the, in terms of like a framing of, this is the context under which movements in Kenya, but increasingly movements and organizations across the continent have to contend with very, very right-wing, very fascist sort of politics at the helm of power in different countries. So when we think about the intersections of the work, we know very, very well the last 30, 40 years of neoliberal politics, what it has meant, the inability of African governments in terms of being able to, social programs, being able to fund the commons of the public. That has gone out of the window. Increasingly, solutions to everyday problems, whether it's education, whether it's land, ecology, all of it is being thrown in terms of like the market. The market becomes this is where we solve particular problems. So this intersections for us, whether we're thinking about gender, we're thinking about the crisis of capital, we're always in a crisis of capital. So thinking about capitalism, thinking about the limitations of the state, thinking about, in terms of like culture wars, the politics of that, what it means to, to live in an increasingly conservative space. But not just conservative, but very particular ideas of how the economy should function, of course, for the very, very particular elite. So when we think about the intersections of the problems, this is a structure that basically frames
it. Thank you very much, Ruth. Now, maybe we can move to other places in the world, and we can start by Latin America. Antolin, I hope that you can hear me well. Antolin? Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Antolin, Latin America has a long history of struggles for land, struggles for territory. Can you tell us a bit more about the situation today, about how social movements are articulating a response to the combined challenges of capitalism and climate change?
Hola, Jacobo. El problema tengo, no escucho en inglés, se llama español. ¿Toda la pregunta me haces en inglés?
Te hago la pregunta en español, sí.
Por favor.
Bueno, entonces preguntaba cómo se presenta la situación hoy para movimientos sociales en América Latina, que tienen una larga historia de lucha por el territorio y por la tierra. ¿Cuál es la respuesta que los movimientos sociales están articulando frente a la situación tanto del cambio climático como las transformaciones del capitalismo?
Sí, buenos días desde Perú y buenas tardes en Europa. Nosotros como organizaciones agrarias, campesinas, hemos sido muy continua en seguimiento de los COP, ¿no? Las conferencias internacionales, del cual Perú en 2014 hicimos un evento paralelo a COP21 y que hacemos un seguimiento grande. Luego nos trasladamos a París, hay un compromiso. De ese compromiso estamos tras de que los gobiernos de los estados deben cumplir Para ello, no solo estamos en Perú una sola organización, somos un articulado de 7 organizaciones indígenas, campesinas. Además, 3 de las organizaciones somos parte de la Colombia campesina. Allí tenemos un espacio de justicia climática donde siempre estamos permanente actualizándonos lo que sucede en el mundo, y que desde allí nosotros apretamos a nuestros estados. En caso Perú, insistimos inclusive después de que Perú tiene una ley de cambio climático, inclusive tiene reglamentado, y con la participación de las organizaciones indígenas, campesinas, allí planteamos para continuar, por ejemplo, plataforma climática indígena. Allí en el Perú estamos de insistir al Estado peruano, a pesar de que hay otros objetivos, hay otras miradas de los gobiernos, pero ahí poquito a poquito estamos ahí trabajando de que es obligación de que los compromisos de los estados deben aplicarse, ¿no? Entonces, hay muchos estados no le cumplen, propiamente Perú, y que hay intereses de grandes empresarios, una mirada de eminentemente de lucrarse o fundarse en este momento. La mirada es nuestra Amazonía peruana, posiblemente otros países del mundo, particularmente Latinoamérica, y que hay empresarios que van veniendo de conseguir grandes espacios, grandes hectáreas de bosque con la finalidad de captura de carbono. Eso es interés de capitalistas, siempre va a venir a aplastarnos, y que ahí corrompen a nuestros gobernantes, allí le facilitan estos espacios que van en contra de la población indígena. De ahí viene pues calentamiento global.
Thank you very much, Antolin. Let me pick up one of the ideas of what you just said about doing business with the climate change, about these carbon offsetting schemes. Means this one's for you, because what Antolin said made me think of something that you told me a couple of days ago when we first met. You told me that you were worried about how large infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia were not only harming the environment and having negative social impacts and negative impacts in terms of human rights, but also were particularly powerful because of their capacity to recast as somehow contributing to the green transition. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having a chance to share here. And yes, when we talk about infrastructure in our region, and we need to mention about the role of China, especially China kind of BRI Belt and Road project. So they are kind of China pushing outward kind of investment in infrastructure throughout the region and many other countries. So next to China, we got these kind of infrastructure, kind of a big investment push from China, many of which are quite problematic. And here I like to mention 2 kind of investment projects. One is some people may know as Myitsone hydropower project, which is started in around 2009 or 2000 in previous military regime in Myanmar, and then temporarily suspended in 2011. So in that hydro, since then, 2011, although these are big hydropower project in very very important critical watershed area in my country, they are kind of pushing again to restart these big hydropower project. This time previously they pushed in the name of kind of energy security. But recently they are kind of pushing as a kind of in the name of green energy solution to the climate change, which is very problematic for the local people, kind of downstream people, peasants and agriculturalists and fisher folks and all these kind of grassroots people. So that's one example that kind of these kind of climate change narrative creating the problem problem for the local population and local people. And to give you the recent example, then recently, you may know all these political crises in my country. Recently, they are pushing again on big railway road project. This one is like more than 400 kilometer long and 9 billion project from China-Myanmar border area to the central city of Myanmar. This is a big, huge price tag, and also a lot of problems associated with this project. But one is a they plan to grab huge part of land. They are demanding sort of 250 meter from each side of railway, which means 500 meter just for the security of the railroad. So this is going to create a huge problem for the several different ethnic group in the area and other social and environmental net impact with these railroad project, which we're not really sure we need it or not be a thorough assessment for relevancy. But they are pushing it in the name of green infrastructure, green transport, mass transport system to carry goods and people suitable for the climate in the context of climate change. So in these two sort of big infrastructure push, or what we are noticing is like they try to, as mentioned in many of the land grab literature, they try to grab the narrative. So this is not direct land grab. Before it started, they try to grab the control of management. They try to get as much concession as possible so that they can manage. So it is control grabbing. But more important in our activist opinion is like this narrative grabbing. China using billions of money, although inside their country they cannot use Facebook. They spend all these billions of money to advertise in social media to persuade local people about all these try to manipulate public opinion, try to persuade the policymaker on relevance of these projects. But in other words, they are trying very hard to grab the narrative. So for us in a social movement, for us in the grassroots movement, very important regard to these big infrastructure projects and regard to all related other investment project is to fight back, to build our own narrative, to counter their narrative in any way we can. This is what we like to share in our current sort of situation in the context of climate change, agrarian justice, and local grassroots people. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can stop there for this topic of countering these green capitalism narratives. But before moving to this topic, I would like to ask to Ian, what is that we understand that we call green capitalism? This is a complicated notion, but at the same time, it's an essentially important notion for understanding how false solutions to climate change have been formulated from different business circles and from international organizations, from a variety of experts. Can you help us, Ian? Can you help us to better understand this notion of green capitalism?
I hope, and I'll try and speak slower this time.
Yeah,
it's a very important point that's been raised about the way that a lot of forms of essentially capitalist extractivism have been recast as greenwashed, if you like. But of course, we have to ask the question, as previous contributors have, whether they address the fundamental twin questions of climate and agrarian justice. And very often they don't. As I said earlier, we must focus on eroding capitalism, not propping it up through the rhetoric of green growth and green capitalism and so on. And as Antolin mentioned earlier on, these massive initiatives around carbon offsetting, for example, supported by a fast-growing voluntary carbon market aiming to reach so-called net zero targets, I think are really highly problematic. They don't tackle the fundamental underlying causes of climate change and may actually cause more problems, as Antolin hinted. These huge tree planting programs being initiated by companies to buy carbon offsets, they may actually end up displacing farmers, pastoralists and others, and actually have very limited benefits locally. So in conceptual terms, these are what one might call creating a technical and spatial fix to resolve capitalist problems. They open up what Karl Marx called the metabolic rift, and so they create green grabs, with capitalist intervention separating people and nature. And by displacing the problem through offsetting, for example, such initiatives actually add to the processes of capitalist accumulation rather than tackling the core problem, which of course is the long-term legacy of fossil fuel consumption in industrialized systems, mostly in the global north. In other words, they're a diversion, politically, and otherwise. So as we discuss in our framing paper, we need to think about more radical climate justice narratives to as Mainzor explained, to reframe the debate, highlighting the historical injustices of what people call unequal exchange or ecological debt, whereby climate challenges in the periphery are the direct consequences of long histories of exploitation and unequal relationships of global power. So rather than being seduced by the easy talk of green growth, triple wins, all the rest of it, we need to take bigger questions of historical injustice raised by the issue of climate change. And I think these are particularly pertinent in agrarian settings and are especially important perhaps in the global south. I don't know whether that answered even part of your question, but anyway.
Well, it answers a part of the question, and it opens plenty of new questions. And I would like to build on one of the questions that one of the topics that you mentioned is the fact that more radical narratives are needed, narratives that take a bigger bigger questions of historical injustice. I think that Ruth Nyambura, in your organizing work as an activist, you have been directly involved for a long time with the production of these narratives. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
I mean, Professor Ian opens up the conversation very, very well. One of the things that I sit with, this is the 4th or 5th COP that's happening in Africa, and it's being called an African COP. And I remember a week ago, Nimo Basi, the Nigerian activist and organizer, saying that it's not an African COP just because it's happening in Africa. You know, this is a death-making machine, literally. One of the things in terms of like a battle of narratives, I don't think people realize how insidious of a space the UN space has become in terms of rubber stamping, not just green capitalism in general, but also just like a space, you know, to quash dissent. So we have all this, one of the things that I've worked on over the last 10 years is around carbon markets, but specifically related to forest-related carbon markets, which is REDD and REDD+, and seeing how communities across Africa, in Kenya, the Sengwer, one of the last remaining indigenous forest dwellers in the world, whether it's in, in Congo, whether it's in Mozambique, literally policies coming out of the UNFCCC, the COP space, the UN space, being funded by the World Bank and the IMF. But also you look at countries like Kenya, where it becomes actual government policy in terms of this is what is green, this is what is climate justice, ensuring that people are evicted from their land, in the name of conservation, in the name of justice. So this is what we are seeing across the continent. A lot of the stories come out, but even more insidious stuff that you never really get to hear about what's actually happening in communities, in local communities. And when you track it, this is stuff that's literally being okayed in the capitals of the world, whether it's in New York, whether it's in London, whether it's in any climate conference happening every single year. So in terms of like movement organizing, I'm going to be very, very clear in the sense that, and this is going to sound a bit sad, it's something I don't want to say myself, but there are quite a number of movements on the continent, working on various intersections, whether it's gender, climate justice, economy, ecology, and whatnot. But I don't think we've quite gotten to the heart of the narrative and heart of the story. And I say this as someone who has literally witnessed in the last 1 month, a very, very conservative government coming into power. And there's a lot of like left pontification of like, this is the way the world needs to be, but very little radical organizing, grassroots organizing, the heart of that stuff that we witnessed maybe 30, 40 years ago, meaning the post-anti-colonial movements. But that's something that we are missing in our movements. It's become very NGOized, very professionalized, and we are literally losing to the other side because the other side is able to speak, for whatever reason, is able to speak the everyday language of the people while we pontificate in different spaces or we speak to each other. But we are actively losing, that radical battle around the multiple, intersections of various forms of oppression that we are facing.
Mm-hmm. Let me continue a bit more with you, Ruth, because you mentioned intersections and you mentioned how the climate change struggle is linked to a variety of other social struggles. And you define yourself as an ecofeminist, and maybe we can pursue a little bit more on this specific intersection between the environmental, the social, and the gender question.
No, I'm just laughing at the term ecofeminist for. Let me not engage it right now, but yes, I'm an ecofeminist. I mean, let me just be very clear. The reason I call myself an ecofeminist, for example, wasn't because of any feminist, before I read any feminist text. It was my own, I live in a country where the land question is so volatile. And every single election, actually, apart from this one we just had, is almost always, in 2007, we almost had a civil war in the country where land agrarian questions, amassed as, ethnicity, tribal questions. And for me, seeing the women in my family, but seeing, peasant women, smallholder women, farmers, in terms of the everyday struggles around land, but also seeing the, the productive and reproductive labor and how, for example, the reproductive labor literally supports every sort of, kind of labor that they're doing, whether it's on the farm or the community in general. That is where my feminist politics emerges from. So, when you think about where we are right now, different feminist movements, eco-feminist movements on the continent, right? You think about the long histories of colonialism because we're still living through those long histories, right? The dispossession, disenfranchisement, not just of African men, but African women in very, very specific ways in terms of like, this is where they're supposed to be. This is what the kind of labor that they're supposed to provide. And of course, patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, it's all encompassing in every single space. So we see, in terms of the economy, we see very, very well in terms of how mainstream economics, for example, does not take into account, right? The exploitation, of course, it's not going to take into account the exploitation of women, of African women, right? The kind of when you think about GDP growth and whatnot, right? So for me, like bringing it all together, it is the oppression that women face in multiple spaces, but also the kind of labor that they provide and produce in different spaces. What does that actually mean? But then also the radical movements that emerge outside of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I would like to pick up this question of the narratives and continue a bit more on this. Antolin, one of the reasons we moved to this topic of green capitalism was because of your remarks on REDD+ and carbon offsetting. Maybe if we take the question from a different point of view of the narratives that social movements in Peru and maybe elsewhere in Latin America are articulating today to counter this green capitalist vision. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Sí, como sabemos, Perú y Latinoamérica tenemos bosque abundante, ¿no? Casi 60%, por ejemplo, en el Perú, es una boscosa en nuestra Amazonía, la rica Amazonía que tenemos y ofrecemos al turismo vivencial. Vienen con todo cariño a conocer, a vivir con nuestro bosque y nuestra parte andina, por ejemplo, mucho por turismo por Cusco y tanto por Montanca, con Ponchito Blanco, y con este calentamiento global va alejándose. Tenemos Arequipa, por ejemplo, volcán. Antes tenía, por ejemplo, Ponchito Blanco. Entonces, como decían las colegas, que es verdad la intervención, ¿no? El capitalismo en el mundo, tanto en América Latina, por buscar el dinero para la inversión. Por ejemplo, yo rescato lo que dice la infraestructura, bueno, en el Perú, a costa de auspicio de Banco Mundial, igualmente BID, ¿no? Y otros bancos que prestan al Estado peruano, a los estados en este caso, y que dejan endeudados. A costa de esto, pues, llevan nuestros recursos naturales. Existe también, igual que en Chile, en Perú, nuestra Amazonía, grandes empresarios van colocando pino y eucalipto. Pino es eminentemente comercial, no es algo que te va, no, igualmente las concesiones, por ejemplo, a los gobiernos, ¿con qué finalidad? La finalidad de estos capitalistas es forrar bosque, ¿no? Hectáreas, miles de hectáreas, los empresarios, luego reemplazarlos con palma citera, ¿no? Con palma citera, que es palma africana, que requiere bastante abono químico, es decir, por eso la pelea hace poco en el Perú, inclusive ha habido varios cambios de los ministros de la finalidad de que el Estado peruano, para solucionar el problema de Ucrania y tanto Rusia, supuestamente desaparecieron este tipo de abonos químicos en el Perú, lo que costaba, por ejemplo, a $25, llegó a costar probablemente hasta $80. Entonces, eso fue algo impresionante. El capitalismo esconde y el Estado peruano y la prensa que tenemos en este momento un gobierno popular y no deja gobernar. Entonces estos empresarios se juntan y dicen, no, crisis, va a haber hambruna y que por falta de urea, lastimosamente la urea es algo oxigenante en el campo, pero también es a la vez depredador, ¿no? Que contribuye al cambio climático, mientras que Perú y las organizaciones vivas indígenas luchamos contra el cambio climático, pero los capitalistas imponen con este tipo de abonos químicos. A partir de allí, pues, generó conflicto en el país y justamente, incluso a partir de esto, hasta vacancia presidencial. Entonces, factores que como nos dominan el capitalismo, como a través de
Excuse me, Antolin. Excuse me, Antolin. May I interrupt you? Sorry for that. But, just before we move to this topic, we might have some time at the end to discuss food systems and food system crisis, which is a very important topic, and we are working right now at JPS on it. But I would like to stay on this subject of the narratives and the way of countering green capitalism. I would like to hear Mint on this, because I mean, green capitalism's promises seem as so yes, thank you. The promises of green capital.
Nosotros, el capitalismo salva la inversión. Para nosotros hemos dicho bien claro, tanto que a Latinoamérica, en el mundo, en este espacio donde yo participo, justicia climática,
excuse me.
Falsas soluciones.
Excuse me, Antolin. Excuse me, Antolin. I would just like to ask a question to Mint, to echo your own perspective about the narratives that we can articulate to counter, and the narratives that are being articulated to counter this green capitalism approach in Southeast Asia.
Para ello, ¿no?
Excuse me, Antolin, I am now asking Mint to join the floor. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think when we talk, that these kind of green capitalism, and also it's a kind of green grabbing. In my country, there's I think similar things happen in many other part of the country, many other part of the world, which is like in last 10 years, then that kind of some area in northern part of our country, they try to designate all these big conservation kind of organization came in to our country and try to designate that's kind of quite important area again in the northern watershed area as a kind of national park. Kind of, which is basically very little kind of, they did not listen anything from the local people, local ethnic group, but they try to create that try to brag that they create this with the help of kind of a national government for the sake of climate change. They preserve these important natural kind of area and natural resources. Again, these might be a kind of similar story maybe happening in many parts of it. And I like to, but I want to move to another maybe a little bit unrelated but similar sort of kind of the thinking line, that which is like what's happening right now in like, let's say in one Asian country, for the sake of security, I will not mention the name of the country, but you will know which country I'm talking. Right now there's a big kind of a huge humanitarian kind of needs and a huge suffering in the local people because of very problematic regime try to the conduct a kind of clearance operation, and try to clearance operation means that they are banning down the village, displacing local population, and kind of blocking kind of food and medicine and everything in and out. So quite brutal clearance operation going on right now in that country. And international kind of aid community like UN humanitarian agency and other big INGO quite kind of that's upset and quite create a lot of kind of the unsettling among the population. Is these big humanitarian agency and INGO, they try to sign, not try, but they sign an agreement to help these area to deliver aid to these people in needs, which is practically almost impossible because these are kind of conflict area and fighting still going on. But their argument is they need to, this humanitarian, they are focusing on humanitarian imperative. They try to help local people. So they are making an agreement with the regime who responsible for all these trouble, all these suffering. So that bring me to the climate change kind of narrated and discourse. A lot of what we are talking is like cool aid, short-term sort of the kind of solutions, not really dealing with like all these humanitarian agency who got in a deal with that regime who create the problems. Similar to that, many of kind of climate change sort of initiatives are like manage cool age sort of solution, not really dealing with all these injustice and all these kind of the repressions and not really dealing with kind of systematic kind of failures, which means that all these problems created by capitalist systems. So when we talk about green grabbing and when we talk about capitalist kind of green climate change, that we are still not dealing with root causes and kind of direct solution, directly talking about injustice and kind of systemic failure, but instead, like kind of humanitarian agency in that crisis country, they are try to cut a deal with the entity who create the problems in the first instance. So that's a bit of kind of a green grabbing issue and the way that we are approaching issue in the context of climate change right now.
Thank you very much, Mint. At the end, this discussion about false solutions and green capitalism basically shows that the problem here is fundamentally about justice. And there's a couple of questions in the Q&A about what to do and how struggles can face this articulation between capitalism and what is basically comes down to greenwashing. Ian, one of the arguments that you make in the framing essay is that the responses to climate change should be based both in an anti-capitalist stance and a trans-environmental stance. These are once again notions that are complex and that need some further reflection to give us some lights on how movements can articulate a response.
Sure. I think the real challenge is to bring together the power of diverse movements and recognize that climate change is part of a common struggle linking environmental and agrarian issues. And the challenge, as I've said before, is to tackle the damaging effects of capitalism and, yes, of course, state socialism. And too often this connection between environmental and agrarian questions isn't made. And very often we end up with environmentalists and agrarian activists in tension. And I think this is dangerous at this current conjuncture. So the core debate I think we need to have is about, as I said before, capitalist relations and their consequences. And as we noted in the framing paper that you just mentioned, when we disagree about climate change, it's often because we disagree about capitalism and thus about the appropriate role for agriculture and land use including wider patterns of ownership and control. And much flows from this. And this is why there are many competing narratives, as we've discussed, and allied solutions, all professing to address the issue of climate change. Some associated with questions of justice, some clearly not, as we've discussed. Let me just take one example, the fraught debates about livestock production and meat consumption. There are many urban-based environmental activists who genuinely argue, in order to meet the climate challenge, we need to radically change diets and abandon livestock production. Even some say stop farming altogether, with a techno-utopian vision of a farm-free future. But such an argument, I think, fails to question the material, social, and political relations of production. Livestock farming isn't uniform. The point is not to argue for no meat, no milk, no farms in order to support climate change objectives, but to focus on what types of livestock farming cause the damage. And of course, this is mostly high input, intensive capitalist farming. So I think a much more nuanced, differentiated campaign stance could bring together agrarian interests and environmental campaigns much, much more effectively if some more sophisticated analysis of underlying causes and interests are made. But of course, in today's world, with highly fractured class positions, diverse contradictory interests, it's very difficult to find common ground for mobilization. And it's important to find those moments, those conjunctures where possible alliances arise. And it's here where the important moments for justice-orientated radical transformation might emerge. So in other words, my argument would be, don't let the divisions between urban elite environmentalism, or what Ruth called left pontificating, which I'm prone to as well, and agrarian struggles get in the way and be diverted by other interests. As in the livestock meat debate, and indeed many others. Instead, we need to seek these progressive alliances, which in Nancy Fraser's terms are trans-environmental, cutting across environmental issues, and anti-capitalist at the same time. And it's around that I see some optimism and hope for future mobilizations.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Antolin, I hope that you can hear me now. If we pursue in this same line, well, the social questions and environmental questions are intimately linked. We are now moving towards the end of the conference, and might be the time to have a little bit of optimism. Do you see some alternatives taking shape in rural Latin America and rural Peru?
Por favor, Jacobo, tengo problemas en el computadora, mejor estoy en celular. Por favor, repíteme en español, por favor.
Bueno, le pedía si nos podía ayudar con un poco de optimismo, tal vez, señalándonos eventuales alternativas que se estén experimentando hoy en las zonas rurales de Latinoamérica y del Perú.
Sí, correcto. Las soluciones es en el mundo, tanto en nuestro medio, Latinoamérica, es concientizar, ¿no?, a las autoridades correspondientes. Hay un compromiso en París, de donde todas y todos tenemos que asumir, particularmente los gobernantes en los países del mundo, particularmente Latinoamérica, donde contamos con bastante bosque. Es trabajar, dejar de trabajar, de utilizar agrotóxicos, agroquímicos, que son eminentemente contribuyentes a este cambio climático. Todos decimos no al clima, no a este clima que eminentemente viene a raíz de grandes empresas en Europa y otros Estados Unidos, como Japón, igualmente Estados Unidos, contaminan. porque deben cumplirse los compromisos en París. Se comprometió todo el gobierno a bajar las emisiones. Esas emisiones es pues muy incoherente porque no encontramos una justicia climática en este momento. Más bien estamos viendo de que permanentemente existen más fábricas, más contaminantes. El Banco Mundial, entre otros financistas, financian para más contribuir, lejos de bajar las emisiones. Entonces eso es nuestros gobernantes que hacen, particularmente la gran corrupción que existe en el mundo. Igualmente, nuestra recomendación como organizaciones agrarias en el Perú, como líder campesino indígena en el espacio internacional, siempre decimos nosotros, la columna vertebral de este tema de discusión, debate de cambio climático, debe ser la soberanía alimentaria. A partir de allí, utilizar, por ejemplo, para abonar nuestros chacras, semillas y mantener nuestra semilla indígena y también los abonos orgánicos. Con eso bajar y trabajar eminentemente diversificado los productos agrícolas. Vemos, como he escuchado a los colegas, de que hay fuerte inversión por parte de los capitalistas de sembrar monocultivo. Es decir, en el Perú ya tenemos grandes agroexportadores que trabajan eminentemente productos no tradicionales para llevar a otros países de Europa, pero utilizan altamente abonos químicos, ¿no? Entonces, eso tenemos que ver desde el gobierno, tiene que haber una inversión de los estados para que hacia el agricultor subsidiar para eminentemente ayudar de producir abonos orgánicos. De esta forma, con eso utilizar, con eso tenemos que bajarlo. Y también reforestar nuestras cuencas, nuestras montañas. También dar algunas directivas desde los gobiernos para no permitir que el capitalismo ingrese a nuestras Amazonías, con otras concesiones, con cuentos de captura de carbono, finalmente talan y siembran palmas citeras, como he anunciado anteriormente. Entonces, todo esto pues va a generar caos, enfrentamiento entre nosotros, finalmente vamos a perder y que va a ganar los capitalismos. Capitalismo ha provocado asesinato a los pueblos indígenas de la Amazonía. Quieren acaparar todo el bosque con otras finalidades, finalmente que enfrenta es el hermano indígena. Por lo cual esto rechazamos tajantemente, más bien creemos que el Estado debe proteger, cuidar. Creo que está también los activistas, las organizaciones campesinas.
Excuse me, Antolin. I'm so sorry to interrupt again, but as we only have 4 minutes left, I would just like to hear Mint and Ruth before we end with basically the same question. Mint, do you see alternatives taking shape on the ground?
I think just quickly, I will refer to the current situation happening in my country. Again, right now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a kind of huge humanitarian crisis and huge suffering of the rural population going on inside the country. There's a very little help from international aid agency and UN agency and big NGO. What we got instead is like hundreds of local organizations who organize themselves to provide help to these people in need. So I just recently I got a kind of terminology from Hugo Slim who are writing a kind of all these kind of organization in Ukraine and Myanmar, and he used the term the humanitarian resistance, the difference from a traditional humanitarian agency. In traditional the humanitarian agency, they proclaim that they are neutral and they run their bureaucratic machines, and they got to deal with maybe people who create the problem in the first place. But the parallel to that is local organization who got little kind of recognition or little understanding from outside the country, but they are the one who risking their life and trying to help people in need. But they did not proclaim they are neutral. They really on obviously they are on the side of the kind of struggle and resistance. They want to win. They want to pursue justice. They want to pursue the greater freedom for the whole society. So for that kind of Hugo Slam kind of dance of humanitarian resistance organization is very much relevant and really kind of reveal what we got inside the country. So similar to this is like in the climate change and
excuse me,
struggle.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to have,
we're going to have this sort of organization, and we need to work more on ground from the ground. So that's the kind of we need to what we could pursue.
Thank you very much, Mint, and sorry to interrupt, but we are nearly at the end. And before we close this opening session, I would like to hear Ruth Nyambura. You have the last words, and you mentioned earlier that you were quite pessimistic about the kinds of reactions that were being articulated, but still, I mean, there is a lot of reflection. There are a lot of alternatives, even if they are not the most visible. Do you foresee any liberatory futures being articulated today, particularly in the African continent?
So I'll start with something that Professor Ian Schoon said, which I totally agree, and I marvel at how, you know, it's a debate. I don't even understand that at the end of the day, when you talk about climate justice or whatever form, whether it's feminism, whether it's gender justice, whatnot, we're actually dealing with a crisis, not crisis of capitalism, we're dealing with capitalism. And I say this again as someone who's seen the last few weeks, whole conservative world unfold in front of me, but also Wangari Maathai, whose death anniversary was yesterday, the first Nobel laureate in this part of the world who fought for the commons in the forest. And to see that 11 years after her death, the government has privatized a public park. And it feels to me, when I look across the continent, different movements, it feels very, very sad. So I don't have a particularly, you know, as I said, I don't want to do a left pontification where we speak to ourselves, where we are trying to tell ourselves that everything is great. It's not great. Things are really, really bad. But at the same time, one of the things that I draw power, kindness, effort from is, oh my God, still very militant, radical movements organizing, challenging. And of course, organizing outside of the last 40 years, where we've had very NGOs, which I spoke about at the very beginning, very NGOs, very professional, very academic also, forms of resistance. But we are seeing bubbling over, you know, the undercurrents of people literally are like, this is not working. This does not make absolute sense. Not with our language, not with our, in Kenya, we call it big English, not with our big English, not with our fancy spaces and conferences and meetings, but everyday people. And of course, this has always happened. It's not something that's happened in the last 2-3 years. You know, there's always been a class of people who resist. And I draw effort from that. The one thing I will say though, I wish there was more deliberate work around cross-movement and transnational movement building. It has to be cross-movement. The feminists have to speak to the unionists. They have to speak to everybody. Everybody has to speak to everybody. Because this idea that only the feminists or the unionists or those working on climate justice, agrarian politics are going to liberate anybody by themselves, it's not going to happen. If we're saying that this is a multifaceted crisis, then it calls for radical cross-movement. As the feminists say, transnational and transversal ideas of solidarity. And I finish with This is my favorite quote. If you've seen me speak, I've probably said this a million times. It's from the Sandinistas. Solidarity is an expression of the people's tenderness. We have to, ultimately, we have to remember that it's not just capitalism, colonialism, slavery, neoliberal globalization. It's not just about the material things, what it transforms. It disconnects us from one another, from ourselves and from each other. So I hope we remember that. Solidarity is an expression of the people's tenderness. And I hope we are tender with one another, that we think about our politics in that way. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. This was a terrific conclusion for today's plenary session. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot to all the panelists, and a big thanks for my colleagues who are running all the different technical side of this.